collaborators, welcome to the Fudds on Film Conspiracy. I am Scott Morris, and I'm joined today by Craig Eastman.
Ma'am, I need you to come back inside. Come back inside, please. I think you should come back inside.
As ever, if you understand Craig's reference, why not send us a tweet for a competition? You can win this respect and admiration of your peers.
Scott, I've made it relevant tonight.
Don't spoil it for the kiddies.
Hi, everyone.
So today we are having a compare and contrast session on Manhunter and Red Dragon, the two cinematic cracks at Tom Harris's novel titled Red Dragon thus far. It is, of course, the serial killer thriller that introduced us to the charismatic cannibal Hannibal Lecter, perhaps more readily associated with Silence of the Lambs. We are taking a look at 1986's Manhunter, directed by Michael Mann, and 2002's Red Dragon with Brett Ratner at the helm. Who captured our imaginations best? Well, there's only one way to find out.
Stop now and assert the conclusion you already know to be true.
And, of course, spoilers will be all over the place in this episode,
Yes.
so you may want to give this a wide berth if you have not seen them so far. Now, of course, they are both based on the same novel, so there's a few minor differences, I think, in plot, but the overarching terms similar enough that I think I can give you the common ground between the two, and we'll deal with any divergences as they pop up when we talk about the individual films. But the bones of the story run that we have an ex-FBI agent, Will Graham, who's called in by his old boss, Jack Crawford, to assist with tracking down a serial killer, referred to as the Tooth Fairy. While Graham is a brilliant investigator, able to put himself in the mind of the people he's tracking, he bears the physical and mental scars from the case that prompted his retirement, the capture of Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter. Despite the misgivings of both his wife and himself, he agrees to help to try and save some lives. There's not too many clues to go on, and as a result, Graham is forced to turn to the brilliant, charismatic, dangerous, but so far safely incarcerated Lecter for assistance in building a profile of this new serial killer, in exchange for small favours, but mainly to give Lecter an opportunity to play mind games with Graham. Graham's also hounded by bottom-feeding tabloid journalist Freddie Lowndes, who will wind up being dragged into investigation to print articles with false profiles in the hope of prompting the killer to make a mistake. Through some detective work, it transpires that the killer is Francis Dollarhide, a monster born of an abusive childhood, who believes that he's undergoing a becoming, transforming into the titular Red Dragon. He's obsessed with the William Blake painting The Great Red Dragon and the Woman Clothed in Sun. He's convinced that the murder of the families that he's undertaking is helping him along the path to a transformation. Do you see? It looks for a moment like there may be some redemption for Dollarhide when he falls in love with a co-worker, Reba McLean, but that's quite short-lived. Things come to a head once Lecter uncovers Graham's home address and smuggles it to Dollarhide, leading to a final confrontation between Graham and Dollarhide, the location of which varies depending on the film, but with a similar outcome. So, I mean, on a strict narrative sense, it's a pretty solid story, enhanced by some accurate, as I understand it, representations of 80s forensic technology and profiling understanding, earning it a few points on the technical level, and the overarching archetype of a copper hunting a villain isn't exactly new, but looking at the story retroactively does it few favours. It might not exactly have been groundbreakingly innovative on its release in 1981, but it perhaps now sounds like a far more familiar tune than it did at the time. In particular, this trope of a damaged but brilliant detective pursuing something or other might have its roots in Sherlock Holmes, but it has been battered to death by every television police procedural in the last 30 years. So most of the cliches only apply to this story sort of retroactively.
Yes.
Right, so I think that's the bulk of the story.
That's
so
pretty much what you need to know plot-wise to cover both films, I suppose. Yes.
Yes, so perhaps, Greg, you might want to give us a bit of a spiel about Michael Mann's Manhunter.
Manhunter, or as I will refer to it, the third best film of the 80s. Scott already knows what I feel is the second best movie in the 80s. And we will be talking about that in short order as well in a future podcast. But yes, Manhunter, I don't think it's going to surprise anyone to know that, we haven't spoken about this prior to this recording, Scott, so I'm going to make the bold assumption that you are at least on board with me in that you would consider Manhunter, the Michael Mann film, to be superior in most ways to Red Dragon, the Brett Ratner film. am I displaying Will Graham-like levels of ability to put myself into your mindset?
Or possibly just remembering me swearing coming out of Red Dragon, I think.
Okay. Did we see Red Dragon together?
I think we must have done it. It would be about the time for it. It's actually, on going back to it, there are positives to Red Dragon that I appreciated more this time around. But, yeah. To spoil the ending, Manhunter is obviously the better film. But
yes,
yeah, go ahead.
Yes, markedly so in the vast majority of respects. So I know that actually Manhunter, surprisingly, especially for a Michael Mann film of this period, it still kind of divides people. I'm always surprised to see that there are still people who just really, really don't like it. And it's difficult for me to talk around that without sounding patronising. But I put that down usually when I'm speaking to people. I get the feeling that it's difficult for people who are watching it now to see past, as what you quite rightly pointed out, Scott, even at the time of the movie's release in 1986?
Yes.
Yeah, where to an extent, or sort of a great extent, very worn plot elements. There is also... Michael Mann is a director in TV and film who has never shied away from, embracing the... shall we say, the aesthetic of the, embracing the aesthetic zeitgeist of the times in which his films are set. So in a lot of respects, visually, his films date. They don't remain timeless, but on the other side of that, I feel like also his films are stylish enough in that the style suits them. I don't know, I might just be making excuses because I love this film so dearly, but Manhunter aesthetically is very definitely an 80s film. It certainly has a much stronger aesthetic than Red Dragon, but I think that probably puts a lot of people off as well, and in combination with that sort of feeling of it being, the troubled detective who puts himself into the mind of his quarries to help catch him. Actually, at the time, by today's standards, that is a trope, but cinematically, this is... kind of, I wouldn't say a groundbreaking movie, but if you put yourself in the context of the time of this movie's release, it was original enough. And I feel like that whole MacGuffin of Will Graham being a character who essentially has this skill that no one else has, which is he doesn't empathise with his quarry, but he has this ability which is both a gift and also haunts him at the same time, to understand the thinking of his quarry and put himself in their mind and reimagine the crimes having taken place, and from that perspective pursue clues that might otherwise have passed his colleagues by. So in this example, the fingerprints that you suggest, dusting a corpse's eyeballs for fingerprints, which no one else thought of. It feels like a kind of flimsy hook to hang something on, but I feel like stylistically Mann delivers more than enough to carry that. And William Peterson, crucially, his performance as Will Graham, which I'm sure we'll discuss in some degree, is vastly superior to Ed Norton's, in my opinion, in the latter film. William Peterson's performance carries it to, I've always thought, like a really surprising degree. I've never really questioned the nature of William Peterson's portrayal of Will Graham, and it's almost a paranormal ability he has, I suppose, and that's as I say, a very flimsy hook to hang something this serious on. But I feel like between them, they really do pull it off, and there's a lot to be said about Bill Peterson's portrayal of Will Graham that I think is really missing from Red Dragon, and maybe I'll bring that up when we talk more about Red Dragon. But for me, it's a police procedural which dabbles enough in almost arcane magics, black magic, if you will, to make it more interesting than the run-of-the-mill. And the characters, all of the key characters, Brian Cox's performance, because a lot of people to this day who won't have seen Manhunter still don't know that Anthony Hopkins is Hannibal Lecter, as far as most people are concerned, right?
Yeah.
Brian Cox portrayed him first, on film at least, in this movie, and gives a markedly different performance to Anthony Hopkins. And I wouldn't necessarily say better, but I would say equally as good, and it really leaves me yearning to think, oh God, what if Brian Cox had gone on to portray him in the subsequent movies? So there's a fantastic performance from him as Hannibal Lecter, where Hannibal Lecter has a tiny, tiny amount of screen time really in this film, but his presence is all over the movie, right? It is a Hannibal Lecter film in the sense that the entire subplot of Hannibal Lecter behind bars, having been put there by Will Graham and ostensibly helping Will Graham to hunt down this serial killer, but at the same time playing both sides and actually trying to leverage the Tooth Fairy in order to exact revenge upon Will Graham, is far bigger of a subplot than you would expect it to be, given the amount of screen time Hannibal Lecter actually has. And there are elements of that Brian Cox, because we will see, ironically enough, Anthony Hopkins and Red Dragon come back and reenact some of the material that Brian Cox did in this movie, and I don't think he does it as well.
No, and I think it's also telling that Cox has a very different take, as you say. It's colder, it's much more restrained, but I think creepier for it. And also, remarkably, I think all of his scenes were shot in 3 days, which is some going, given the shadow that he casts over the rest of the film. Something that is such a relatively slender proportion of the actual shooting time affects so much of the rest around it. Yeah, absolutely. And then the other crucial aspect from a character point of view is obviously Tom Noonan's portrayal of Francis Dollarhide. And comparing Tom Noonan to Ralph Fiennes is kind of in any role you're trying to put them, surely chalk and cheese. The guys, these are two actors who have vastly different styles, vastly different physical presences on screen. And if you rolled a dice or picked a role out of a hat and said, who do you think would fill this role better, Ralph Fiennes or Tom Noonan? 9 times out of 10, you'd probably put your money on Ralph Fiennes. But Tom Noonan as Francis Dollarhide in Manhunter, to me, gives just such an amazing performance that Ralph Fiennes cannot even begin to make the role his own in Red Dragon. Again, we'll probably talk about that more in a minute. But Tom Noonan as Francis Dollarhide gives this such a deeply unsettling performance, both in terms of his delivery, his embodiment of Dollarhide, but also his physical presence on screen. He uses his posture, his physique, his stance, really sets him apart from everyone else and gives you this impression of this almost alien character who, as we gradually become aware of his backstory and in a much more subtle way than Red Dragon manages, he's a really, really interesting character, but it's very difficult to find him sympathetic in any respect. I suppose maybe Ralph Fiennes does a better job of making his character a little bit more sympathetic, as much as you want to empathise with either of these characters. I think as Will Graham says in Manhunter, I think it comes as a child my heart bleeds for him. But as an adult, I think someone ought to blow him out of his effing socks. One of the great lines. Yeah, Tom Noonan's performance as Francis Dollarhide is just, I kind of want to put it in a bubble and hold it up and say, look, here's one of the great performances of not even just a serial killer, but one of the great antagonist performances of the decade, certainly. And how quickly people forget what an amazing actor Tom Noonan actually is when he's given good material to work with, because here he's sinister, he's alien, he really is a threat. I think it's certainly one of the key differences is that Michael Mann, like on paper, if you look at the cast of this and Red Dragon, it should be an easy shoe-in for Red Dragon, but Mann has got much better performances out of his characters here. Like, there's only perhaps one film that William Peterson is better in, and that's To Live and Die in LA, and believe you and me, we'll be talking about To Live and Die in LA at some point.
If you thought I was going to bore you to death about Manhunter.
But even the rest of the cast, I mean, I have no strong opinions on either Tom Noonan or even Dennis Farina, but you would struggle to find better performances from either man here. And that's kind of across the board in a way that doesn't happen in Red Dragon. And that is probably the critical juncture in this. Michael Mann has managed to get the absolute most out of what's been given to him. And I think that really does help a hell of a lot in keeping the story, well, not just entertaining, but also quite captivating.
The key thing that I think makes Dollarhide more interesting in this film than in Manhunter is that he does have an internal struggle as a character. He does try and battle his demons. He reaches the precipice of redemption in both movies through his interaction with the character of Reba McClane, and at the last minute sort of tips back into the character that the Red Dragon wins out. But Tom Noonan's portrayal is much more nuanced. I feel like Ralph Fiennes' portrayal of that struggle is bordering on, not slapstick, but it's almost bordering on comedy in some places. The sort of talking to himself, the very exaggerated conversation, the monologue he's having with himself about his condition and talking to this character of the Red Dragon who he thinks is steering him. But in Tom Noonan's
case, it's all
case,
about Smeagol, isn't it?
Yeah. It really is. That is absolutely the best comparison. You're right. Whereas Tom Noonan does it in a much more subtle way that I think is massively more effective, because you're in no doubt as to what is going on in his head, but he's much more reserved about it, which feels much more in keeping with the character and the sort of the repressed nature of the character, which for reasons of his backstory, that repressed nature which has kind of led to him becoming the character he has. It feels more in keeping with that than this very extroverted performance from Ray Fiennes, which is not to say that Ray Fiennes isn't good, because Ray Fiennes is one of those actors, it's probably quite hard for him to be crap in anything. But certainly in Red Dragon, I don't think he makes as good a fist of Dollarhide's character as Tom Noonan here. And I absolutely love Tom Noonan in this in almost every respect. I think Dollarhide's a really compelling character, not in a sort of sympathetic way necessarily, not in a way that you're kind of rooting for him in any sense. But if serial killer movies they're guilty of a number of crimes in general, serial killer narratives, and one of those is usually that the serial killer's just not that interesting of a character. And I feel like Francis Dollarhide here, in a far more nuanced performance than you might expect, turns out to be a massively more satisfying character for it.
Yeah, so I guess it's a tough thing to do in any of these kind of films. When you're limiting yourself to 2 hours, it's difficult to have an investigator that is at one point charismatic enough to carry a film and also build a serial killer at the same time. And that's why films like this tend to be entertaining enough. It's a strong enough foundation. But when you actually think about the more interesting villains in sort of serial killer fiction, it would tend to be something from television. Something like where you can build an arc for a character, like something like Dexter, where it'll have an enemy serial killer going over a course of a whole series. And of course, in that one, your lead character is also a serial killer, so it's a nice double whammy in that one. But
that's it, doubling down.
But Manhunter certainly develops that a lot better. There's some other points that at random that come to me. You mentioned earlier about the sense of style that this film has, and that's probably its defining characteristic. There's more style, certainly some more gorgeous cinematography in the first 10 minutes of this film than most films features in 2 hours, and certainly more than Red Dragon does.
Yeah, I think it's some of Dante Spinotti's best work, and that's saying something.
Yeah, I mean, even something as simple as just having someone run down some stairs. There's that fantastic shot of just them running down, look like a kind of diagonal staircase. It's kind of a long shot of that, which is held for just long enough to be actually quite visually arresting without actually being as boring as a shot of someone running down some stairs ought to be.
Yes.
Part and parcel of the atmosphere that this builds is the soundtrack, which, for my money, a bit of a mixed bag. Certainly early doors, all these synth-heavy parts sound absolutely amazing. They've got this really eerie, unsettling atmosphere. It's like if Blade Runner had a couple of very bad nightmares, it would be something like the work you get here. And that works really, really well, but there's the odd, just strong baffling choice. I do not understand why that song is there. That kills the mood for me. It's such a pivotal scene.
It's because so out of place. Michael Mann, he latches onto certain, or in this period certainly, he latched onto certain pieces of like new wave electronic 80s prog pop, and just was like, yeah, I'm going to have that in my film. And contextually, they're just, it's those more than anything date it in a bad way. Yeah, I knew exactly what you were going to say there when you started saying. It is, though. It's the rest of the soundtrack. The original pieces for this soundtrack are just phenomenal, but the stuff which... Actually, I've never bothered to look into it. The songs like the one I've just given you a flawless rendition of there. I'm assuming that was a licensed piece. And a personal choice of Mann's, and it's like, oh, Michael, you could have done better.
Yes, you have done better in the same film.
Yes, you have. Yes. What were you thinking of, Michael? Come back to us, Michael. Yes, but aesthetically, it's still a bit of a powerhouse.
Yeah, it's very distinctive in a way that certainly if you're familiar with Mann's other work of the era, you're not going to mistake this for anything else.
Yes,
than a Michael Mann film. So it's got a very real.
And I feel like in the licensed music stakes, he does kind of get a free pass for the entire denouement of the movie is edited together to the extended version of Iron Butterflies in Agada de Vida. Famously, which is just perhaps like my favourite 10 minutes of, one of my favourite 10 minutes of film of all time. I just think that's an amazing edit, even the planning of it, the mixing, the edit of that whole sequence, I just absolutely love. There's a couple of jump cuts there, which I think the first time I saw the movie, I thought like, oh, have they had to splice the film there? Have they made a mistake? And then I think probably the second time I watched this movie when I was a bit older, I realised actually, man, this is amazing. When I watched that scene again, I'm like, oh, this is just so good. It's just like that whole sequence, I think, is from a cinematography point of view, from an editing point of view, from a musical point of view, that's just a tour de force. I absolutely love it.
Indeed. Slight difference narrative-wise in the ending in this one. I'm not quite sure if that was just done simply to rein the running time in. I suppose it's
I don't know.
Difference.
Some of it feels slightly abrupt and a bit like cashing in. But I'm not. I'd actually, bizarrely, for a film that I'd love as much as Manhunter, I haven't actually read the source material, so I'm not sure. I'm not sure what Harris did in the novel. Perhaps I should rectify that.
Yeah, so in the novel is closer to what the Red Dragon ending is, where Dollarhide is sort of fakes his own death and they kind of save Reba, and then everyone thinks, it's all fine. Graham goes back to his family in Florida, and then surprise, surprise, Dollarhide's out again. So you kind of get a fake out ending, and then the real ending is going. But I mean, as I say, the fight takes place in a different place, but is effectively the same in both films.
Yeah,
at least in terms of the narrative function, if not the actual shooting of it. So yeah, a strange, what seems to be a major difference, but is actually relatively minor in terms of anything to do with the emotional impact of it. So
yeah.
I shall forgive it that.
Yeah.
Also, puzzlingly, I do not know why they've changed the spelling of Lecter. That is a strange one.
That's right. Yeah, I'd forgotten about that.
Where'd that come from?
Yeah, the CKTO.
Lecter.
Dr. Lecter.
Well, see, Hannibal and cannibal rhymes, so if we get Dr. Lecter, maybe that's...
Dr. Hannibal the Cannibal Lecter. Yeah, the other big, but we should probably use this to lead into a bit of a discussion on Red Dragon then before we tie up. But the other big difference, I think, just to look back to William Peterson's performance, I almost forgot that I wanted to mention this, is that Peterson's performance as Will Graham is, I think it's more accomplished and it's much more satisfying than Ed Norton gives in Red Dragon, in that superficially it's a far more physical performance. I think obviously the issue of Will Graham's character is that he is balanced on the precipice between sort of almost becoming a serial killer himself, right? He's a man who's very much at war with his deeper psyche, and the experiences he's had utilising his gift in the pursuit of his career have left him psychologically in a very precarious position. And I feel like Peterson's portrayal of Graham conveys that much more effectively. In fact, I don't even think Ed Norton's does it at all. But William Peterson's performance as Will Graham, you're never in doubt that this is a guy who's always on the edge of something. Violence is always just a moment away. Like right from that early scene where he throws Freddie Lowndes onto the bonnet of a car. Like in Red Dragon, Ed Norton just kind of pushes him against the car, whereas in this, like, Will Peterson grabs him and flips him up and over onto the bonnet and smashes the windscreen. He's a man absolutely on edge, and it's a more just and balanced enough performance, and also physical enough, that suggests he's always just a moment away from some sort of reckless violence himself. You always feel like Will Graham in this film is really at a pivotal point, or certainly is reaching a pivotal point, and having gone back to work again, like he said he wouldn't do for that one last job. You always feel like something might actually come of that throughout this movie. When I don't think, having watched Red Dragon again there the other day in preparation, I really didn't get that impression from Ed Norton's portrayal at all. It was almost by the by. It was hinted at early on in the movie, and then nothing really was made of it again, which made the character substantially less interesting. But I don't know. I know others may disagree, but I don't know, Scott. What do you think, comparison-wise? I mean, Red Dragon, obviously there are minor plot differences and whatnot, but in terms of that performance...
Yeah, I mean, I suppose even just widening it out, just because we've not really stated it explicitly, the cast for Red Dragon, as kind of mentioned, should, on paper, be a lot better. You've got not only Anthony Hopkins back as Hannibal Lecter, but Ed Norton's there, normally highly dependable, certainly around this time when he was appearing in pretty much every second film, but he's still managing to do a good job in most of them.
Yeah.
Harvey Keitel plays his boss, Emily Watson's in as Reba McLean, and Freddie Lowndes is Philip Seymour Hoffman this time, and as we mentioned, Ralph Fiennes is Dollarhide. Now, that, on paper, ought to blow the cast of Manhunter away. in my opinion, that's some really good actors in there. And certain characters do much better, of course. Philip Seymour Hoffman's better in the role of Teddy Lowndes. Manages to get feel a bit more sleazy, because that seems to be always a Hoffman certainty.
I do still like Stephen Lang in Manhunter, but he's a bit more of a caricature of a character, I think, than sort of convincingly sleazy.
Yeah, and I think overall the supporting characters come away pretty well in Red Dragon. I have no complaints with most of those guys' performances. The problem, I think, is perhaps a wider one with Brett Ratner, in that he's not someone who has ever tried to interject and stamp his own mark on any film at all.
No.
Now, I think this is the problem. I mean, the short answer of the problem is there should have been a point where he stepped in and told Ed Norton to up his energy and Anthony Hopkins to down his energy.
Yeah.
He's not done that. I think he's probably been a bit more trusting in however the actors want to play it, which might have served well in some situations, but here I think it's pushed a little bit to the end of pantomime. Anthony Hopkins overshadows everyone else with his almost pantomime gurning in this. It's noticeably ramped up from Silence of the Lambs.
Yeah.
And I think it overshadows anything Ed Norton tries to do, and he just seems a bit, I don't know, dazed throughout this entire film. He just kind of stumbles around. I suppose that is why I didn't like this in the first instance. Was I think at that point I had a bit of a hate on for Ratner, because I've always viewed him as he's just a generic talentless hack. I think
he's a hack.
I don't think he's talentless in that regard. There is a role for the kind of thing he does, especially if you look at it from a studio perspective. He's someone you can hand a colossal amount of money, some possibly recalcitrant actors, and as long as he's got a functioning script and a camera, he will give you something that is exactly the sum of those parts.
To this day, I still really, really enjoy the first two Rush Hour movies for what they are.
Yeah, and I think that's just because at that point, Chris Tucker and Jackie Chan showed up and decided to want to play that day. And if they had, I don't think Ratner would have been able to coax anything out of them, as he hasn't here. But because they wanted to do it and they had a serviceable script, you get some good films. But there's any number of films where people have showed up and if they're being a bit lazy, Ratner's not picking up on it. He's just doing his job, getting things done, going through the shot list. I'm sure he's a very efficient director, but it's not actually making great films. There's no style to Brett Ratner's work. He may inadvertently stumble across something, but there's no singular auteur vision throughout his work.
It feels like it was probably a case of the studio saying, right, okay, if we get a good enough cast together, all we really need to do here is have someone who we know is competent and marshalling this kind of thing, and we're already spending X amount on the cast. We may as well splash out on someone who commercially has been a successful director up to this point. And so from that, purely from a bean counting point of view, it's like, that kind of makes sense. But as you say, it's difficult.
It's difficult to be excited about a Brett Ratner film.
There's not a frame of this that you look at and go, yep, that's a Brett Ratner film. No. Whereas how many stills could you take from Manhunter and probably show it to someone who hadn't seen Manhunter before and be like, yeah, that's Michael Mann, isn't it? Yeah, it's just, and I wonder also as well how much of that comes down to you've got some appreciably big egos. Look at your three leading men, right? Anthony Hopkins, Edward Norton, and Ralph Fiennes. Now, each one of those guys has reputations for being occasionally difficult, depending upon which director you talk to, etc. So you can imagine those guys coming in and going, no, I've got my own fully formed idea of what this character's doing. Brett Ratner trying to get his 2 pence worth in and being told, right, okay, yeah, Brett, go put the kettle on, mate. Go and put the kettle on. We know what we're doing, right? I'm not sure whether Brett Ratner as a director would have had the moxie to step in and go, no, actually, this is what I want you to do, guys, so shut up and do as you're told. I know, I've read reports that he can be sort of bullheaded and stuff, but you've got to imagine you've got that guy in the same room as Anthony Hopkins, Ed Norton and Ralph Fiennes, and he's probably got the quietest voice in the room, right? Yeah. But yeah, the result of it is that actually this is a film which feels like it needed a stronger hand at the tiller in order to shape it. Brett Ratner doesn't drill down into anything. He only paints with a really broad brush. Anytime, well, I've only seen the movie twice, so when we saw it and then again now, and both times, I remember at the time thinking that Ed Norton's portrayal of Will Graham was superficial to the point of, have you forgotten this is Will Graham? His prowess was barely alluded to, or certainly, I think maybe in terms of the script, it's referenced as often as Manhunter, but Ed Norton's performance doesn't do anything to betray that internal struggle that the character has.
He seems largely bored by everything that's going on.
He comes across almost entirely, apart from this fact that he's able just to pull insight out of his ass, he comes across as though he may be like in his first year of doing this job, right, or his sophomore year as a homicide detective or something, and still a bit green, rather than this character who's supposed to have been completely through the mill to the point where he was psychologically broken, and has now been asked to come back and do this other job, and his wife is worried about the fact that this is going to tip you over the edge again, and I'm really worried that something terrible is going to happen to you and you're going to end up in a loony bin, because that's the character of Will Graham. There's no sense of this at all. When you talk about Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter in this film, if I remember correctly, what's ironic about it, because you're absolutely right, it is a bit more caricature. Or I don't know if caricature is the word, but there is that feeling of he's comfortable in here and he's playing to a type now. I seem to remember that the whole point of Ratner going all out and the studio going all out to get Anthony Hopkins, or was it Hopkins had said that he agreed to come back and do the role because he felt that in Hannibal the character had gotten to a point where actually people had forgotten what he was supposed to be, and people were rooting for him as an anti-hero, and people were kind of rooting for his character and backing his character and be like, oh, I can't wait to see whose brain he eats next. And he wanted to take it back to the almost to the start and remind people, because obviously this version of Red Dragon is chronologically is canon, right? So this is supposed, in fact, the end of the movie leads directly into the start of Jonathan Demme's Silence of the Lambs. Yeah. So ironically enough, if that was Hopkins' stated intention of coming back and doing this movie, then actually he's delivered so far wide of the mark of what he intended to do, which was to remind people why Hannibal Lecter was such a scary character in the first place, because I felt very little threat emanate from him in this. Brian Cox projects Hannibal Lecter out of that cell that he's trapped in for his small amount of time screen. You can feel him reaching out with his influence and manipulating things outside in the world, whereas Anthony Hopkins, and that is genuinely terrifying, the fact that this guy has the power to put your family and other people in danger from inside a prison cell with nothing but a phone. And his own, deceitfulness and cunning could end your family's lives. Whereas there wasn't really, I didn't feel that emanate from Hopkins in this at all. And that's one of the reasons why I think, oh, wow, if only we could have seen Cox fill that role in subsequent movies. But
I wonder if he would have done much better in this script, because...
Not in this script, but then you would have to... He wouldn't have been on board for this, right? Because he would have essentially been remaking the same film.
I mean, part of the problem with this is that... largely due to the chronology of it, there's much more Hannibal Lecter in this film, which commercially there is no sensible way around this. You would have to do it. He's been effectively the star of two previous films. There needs to be more in it, and that's kind of why they actually got to the point of filming the struggle between Graham and Lecter as at the start of this film, which is only actually referred to by Graham as he kind of speaks. And for my money, having Peterson speak it is actually a much more effective way of telling it, because you can kind of feel how it's kind of deadened him, whereas actually seeing the struggle is a bit less interesting on a number of levels. They're
kind of bound, because at this point it's the character of Lecter. So Francis Dollarhide and Will Graham and the battle between them is the main plot line of the movie, but whose face is it on the poster, right? It's Anthony Hopkins. Because they're selling Hannibal Lecter, they're not selling Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide. Nobody, essentially, the movie market they're aiming for doesn't give a shit about Will Graham and Francis Dollarhide. They probably don't know who they are. So they're selling it off the back of Hannibal Lecter. So, they've convinced Hopkins to come back. They presumably just drove a dump truck outside his house and just tipped it up and emptied a load of money onto his porch to get him to come back. So you kind of, again, from a studio point of view, you can imagine the studio like, no, we need to make sure he has this amount of screen time because we want our money's worth. And there are a couple of scenes that he's reasonably effective in, which aren't in Manhunter. The one where he's in the sort of the enclosed yard and he's strapped to the what do you call it, the track.
The swing ball tether.
Yeah, he's on a swing ball tether. That's quite an interesting little scene. But as I say, there's none of that sense that he's projecting influence out with the bounds of his cell, really, in this film. Although a lot of the script, and especially that scene where he phones up and where he finds out Will Graham's address in Marathon, is essentially word for word the same script as used in Manhunter. There's far less of a sense of threat involved there, which is disappointing. So one of the other things that disappointed me was that Emily Watson's performance as Reba McClane I found oddly overcooked, and I don't know if it's just, this is going to sound really bizarre, but I feel like Joan Allen did a far better job of portraying Reba McClane in Manhunter. The first thing about the character that defines the character of Reba McClane, of course, and is crucial to her relationship with Frances Dolarhyde, is that the character of Reba McClane is blind, and she works in the same photo lab where Frances Dolarhyde works. And this will sound really trivial, but Joan Allen's physical performance as a blind person felt far more convincingly restrained, and I felt like Emily Watson, and again, I'm probably drilling down far too much here, but even just the wideness of Emily Watson's eyes, I felt like Emily Watson was trying far too hard to remind me that her character was supposed to be blind, whereas with Joan Allen it felt far more natural. But I found that more of a detraction in Red Dragon, and which is a shame because Emily Watson is an actor who obviously has done amazing work, and you would expect her, again, in keeping with the rest of the cast, you would expect her to be outstanding and under-delivers in this movie, because hers is probably the most physically, or should be the most physically pronounced role in the film. It kind of singles her out. I don't know if that makes sense. And then Harvey Keitel just feels like, why did you bother getting Harvey Keitel? You could have got anybody to fill that role, because he doesn't bring any Harvey Keitel to it. But, there are some actors actually returning in the same roles as their characters from previous films, like Anthony Held portrays Dr. Chilton. Frankie Faison returns as Barney Matthews, although he gets, 2 lines or something, which I seem to remember as well. Ted Talley saying that if he'd realised that Faison was coming back to reprise his role as Barney Matthews, he would have given him much more material. So there you go. But it's a strangely disappointing film in terms of performances of everyone involved, and it's
very much a film that is telling and not showing. Like, we kind of talk about Will Graham. He's a brilliant investigator, people say, but no, there's no actual evidence of that. And similar with...
apart from people saying what a brilliant investigator he is.
Yeah. And it's the same with Ray Fiennes. There's that whole monologue about, of course, you're very strong and physically imposing, Ray Fiennes. And you look at Ray Fiennes and you go, well, not really.
Yeah.
Certainly nothing like compared to Tom Noonan's looming presence. Ray Fiennes does not cut it. And there's awkward performance moments in both films. I mean, there's... in particular, that moment where either Ed Norton or William Peterson is halfway up a tree going, that's how you watch them, you son of a bitch.
You son of a bitch.
And both people flub those lines very badly. I suspect they just wanted to get down from the tree, but while in Peterson's performance that stands out as one awkward moment, Ed Norton's performance in this is a whole series of awkward moments, and it just doesn't work particularly well. I blame his hairstyle.
Oh my days, that's the other thing, is that I don't feel like they didn't push the aesthetic enough in Red Dragon, because it is supposed to happen. The events are supposed to take place in the same sort of time period as those in Manhunter, right? So it remains chronologically correct as per the text. So it is set during the 80s, but whereas you can accuse Mann of overcranking things a bit, not that he would know at the time he was overcranking it, but because he would double down on, because he's a guy with a, he's a very aesthetically driven director, just by virtue of that, his films emanate the sense of period much more than perhaps another director would have done in that time.
Yeah, his dials start at 11.
Yeah, exactly. They go all the way up to what? Here I feel like actually the 80s aesthetic was downplayed, and I didn't have that sense necessarily of it chronologically fitting in with Silence of the Lambs, which is odd. The one thing that I really appreciate in Red Dragon, though, over Manhunter, and I wish that, and it's always bothered me that because it's such a pivotal scene in the context of the character of Dolarhyde, and obviously again, having not read the source material, I can only assume that in the novel it's that important of a plot development point, or not a plot development point, but a sort of vignette in informing the character and his struggle with the Red Dragon persona, is that Red Dragon has at least got the nuts to include the scene where Dolarhyde goes to, I can't remember the institute where it's housed, but he actually goes and secures a viewing of the original Red Dragon, Blake's original Red Dragon print, and then eats it.
Yes.
Which on paper is bizarre, but actually in Red Dragon it's one of the better scenes, I think, actually. And it's always bothered me, because I didn't know about it, having not read the novel, I didn't know about that scene until I'd seen Red Dragon, or sort of like the pre-release hype for it. And it's always bothered me since then that I've always wrestled with what was it about that Mann decided in a film where your character essentially has psychic powers. You know, why is a man eating a painting?
Yeah, that's too much.
Yeah, you know, why is that tipping things too far? And it seems like such a pivotal scene for the character that's always bothered me a bit that Mann left it out of Manhunter, but I might feel differently about it. One of the other amazing scenes, obviously, Manhunter does handle a lot better than Red Dragon, is the scene where Dollarhide takes Reba McClane to the vets to fondle an anaesthetised tiger, which is it feels like it kind of catches you, comes from a bit out of the left field, and is this really stunning moment of humanity in Manhunter. Yeah,
it's slightly forgotten about it and wasn't expecting it when it showed up. And I watched Red Dragon first, but there's that bit where they fondle a tiger.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
where he takes, you know, and that's at the point at which it's the pivotal point in informing the notion that he might not be beyond redemption.
Yeah.
And developing his relationship with Reba, he makes this really quite a profound gesture of humanity that reminds you that this is still a human being underneath this veneer of this what has become a really terrible and terrifying and hugely, obviously, psychopathically unbalanced character. But there is still a glimmer of humanity there, an actual very sort of profoundly caring emotion that he takes Reba McClane to a tropical vet, an exotic vet, and she's allowed to sort of to feel her way, sense her way around this the prone form of an anaesthetised tiger and feeling its heartbeat and feeling its teeth, and you can imagine how powerful a gesture that would be for someone to make to someone in that position. And it kind of, in Manhunter, it really, first time I saw it, it really caught me off guard, and I don't think, I was probably at an age where I wasn't able to parse that properly. And then again, when I watched it for the second time when I was a bit older now, I really realised just how strongly I felt about it as a movie. It becomes maybe the most important scene in the film, actually, in some regards. And again, because it catches you completely off guard and you find yourself feeling some sort of, whether you like to or not, it's hard not to feel some empathy for the character of Dollarhide, and it really starts to it starts to play with that notion of, is he really beyond redemption? Whereas Will Graham obviously has a very definite opinion as to what should happen to him. And in Red Dragon, this scene, it feels almost perfunctory. It feels like the scene where he eats the painting ought to have replaced that in terms of the internal struggle, because obviously at the point at which he walks out of the museum, he suddenly feels more empowered, and there's he's eating this painting. He thinks he's put that persona to bed now. He's beaten the Red Dragon. He's literally consumed the Red Dragon, and it can't do anything to influence him now. And obviously that doesn't work out too well in the end. So I kind of feel like maybe the reason why the scene with the tiger doesn't work as well in Red Dragon is because Ratner and/or Talley, who wrote the script, had the nuts to go ahead and do the thing with the painting. And maybe that's what Mann realised. Maybe he realised one or other of those scenes. I might just have answered my own question. I can imagine Mann maybe looking at it and thinking, well, one or other of those scenes will be sufficient for a 2-hour movie. Might work better in the course of a book that takes 8-9 hours to read. But what else? Is there anything else that Red Dragon succeeds at where Manhunter either not necessarily fails, but maybe doesn't dare to tread, Scott? Because it's not, for all that it's inferior, I think, objectively inferior to Manhunter in most regards, it's not a terrible film.
No, I mean, as I say, when I first watched it, I don't remember clearly why I didn't like it, and I can only find sort of scant passing references to it in sort of previous material that I've written. And having watched it again, it does seem overly harsh. I enjoyed it watching it this time round. It is not as good, but it's still actually very competent.
Do you know what I think? The only thing I can think of, because I sat there after I watched it and I had exactly the same feeling. I thought, wow, I enjoyed this more this time round, and it didn't seem... I seem to remember when we watched it in the cinema, I seem to remember feeling like this is just so wantonly stupid. I don't think that was a fair assessment at the time. Actually, it's far more competent than I thought the first time round, and I think at this point, the only thing I can think of as to why I rejected it so badly at the time was that I think I was in a period where I felt like Ed Norton could do no wrong. And I can't remember if this came out before or after the 11th Hour, but I seem to remember that he agreed to make Red Dragon so that he could get 11th Hour funded, and Ed Norton had just been nailing it, and I was full on Team Norton at that point. The man could do no wrong. And I think maybe this is the first time I saw him in something where I probably felt really, really disappointed at the time, whereas really his only crime here is to be underwhelming.
Yeah.
And I think maybe that magnified my feelings. I felt like Ed had let me down, man. And then, of course, we saw the remake of the Italian Job, and less said about that, the better.
One area that I might have expected it to be better would be the score, but actually the score in Red Dragon is, if anything, worse. It is kind of that. It's got a kind of old school cinematic, properly overbearing vibe to it.
Well,
and
it's
found
your
it was
man. What's his name? Isn't it? It's your boy Danny Elfman, and it's a Danny Elfman score, but it ain't a Danny Elfman movie.
Yeah. I found it it's one of those ones that kind of actually undercuts drama rather than enhances it. It's all just a bit much. So, yeah, I don't think there's really any aspects where I could hand on heart say that Red Dragon does it better. But I don't think Red Dragon ever does it particularly badly.
No.
It's from, we're talking about Ed Norton's performances here, it's still adequate. And for all Hopkins is gurning, it's kind of expected by this point. It was what you were more or less expecting, probably having seen Hannibal. And
for all its lack of sort of stylistic flair and stuff, I think it will probably aesthetically it will age better than Manhunter has, right? If you find that stuff, if you find very overtly period sort of, fashion references and stuff off-putting, if you find that sort of stuff that actually becomes a bit sort of kitsch and hammy and can sort of detract from a film in that way, then this is going to be less guilty of that. That's the other thing that I forgot to mention, Scott, was that Brett Ratner went out of his way to get Dante Spinotti to return as cinematographer for this, which I find really surprising because, again, much in keeping with the cast, I don't feel like this has got his stamp on it. It doesn't. I can't think of a scene that approaches anything like the flair or the stamp of the guy's work that is just written all over Manhunter. And I don't know how much leeway he was afforded to do his own thing by Brett Ratner, or whether, because Brett Ratner, I suppose, can be quite a visually driven director anyway, whether or not he had a very definite idea himself and Dante Spinotti didn't have full reign to do his own thing creatively, or whether it was just, it's fine, I'll take the paycheck. You're going to pay me twice what I would normally get at this point, so yeah, I'll do it, and I'm not that bothered. But that was one of the things that really disappointed about it, was that there's none of the sort of impactful, sort of really resounding imagery that Manhunter sort of threw about with, not with abandon, but used so effectively. So I think my takeaway from this was that, surprisingly, Red Dragon, not as pish as I remembered.
It's
but
not like it.
Yeah, it's not going to take Manhunter's place in my heart.
Yeah, and I watched the other films in the series just for a bit of context. And
did you?
Yeah, Silence of the Lambs still holding up pretty well. It is underneath Manhunter for me, but it's those two, then Red Dragon. Hannibal is just a bit too over the top
It's
for my
a
liking.
pantomime now, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and if anything, it gets even worse with Hannibal Rising, and you don't have at least Anthony Hopkins knows how to overact, and the poor fellow they've got in Hannibal Rising is not up to the task. And I think also his credibility was somewhat hampered by him looking like a young Chris Morris, so I kept expecting him to break into some day-to-day shenanigans, and never quite getting there. So I
haven't seen Hannibal Rising, and on the strength of that short review, yes, I'll avoid it. You're quite right though, Anthony Hopkins, I mean, as much as he can be a bit of a ham, he's almost always a perfectly cooked ham. So when he's required to be, I always think back to Hannibal, and I think that's what made it work. And you can understand why he became a real anti-hero in that film, because it was still, for what it was still an incredibly well balanced performance, because it never quite went full turbo. But who else is going to deliver a line like, try peeling off your face and feeding it to the dog?
It's the cut back to the poor schlub in the wheelchair saying, well, it seemed like a good idea at the time.
Yeah. Was it Gary Oldman who portrayed...
Yes, although why?
Why, right, exactly.
Could have been anyone.
Could have been anyone.
Yeah, in many respects, the less said about Hannibal, the better, but there's still... When did I watch it? 4 years ago? 4 or 5 years ago I saw it last. I'm like, yeah. I probably enjoyed it more than I did. I think I saw it at a midnight screening when it was released. And the shared experience of an audience also the brain eating scene thing was almost worth it. But yeah, it's definitely more of a pantomime piece, isn't it? I think you've got the order of ceremony right there, Scott. I would definitely go Manhunter, then Silence of the Lambs. Although I think we might be in the minority there, because I do still think Silence of the Lambs is held in higher regard than Manhunter, generally speaking. But for whatever reason, personally, Manhunter just always struck a perfect sort of balance of aesthetic and dramatic chord with me.
Yes, well, I did ask the crowds firstly on the Twitter polls to see if they had anything on there.
And what did the great unwashed reply?
While it is perhaps a self-selecting bunch of film nerds who follow us, it is no great surprise that Manhunter did a clean sweep. Admittedly, only 6 people bothered to vote, but 100% for the Manhunter. But out of the interests, I did actually create a Google Plus page,
right?
Just for the hell of it, because Google Plus, unlike post-Brexit Britain, loves polls. So 60 respondents on this one, and
wow.
Actually, Red Dragon edges it by 53 to 47%.
What?
Which was a surprise to me. Now, I'm not altogether convinced of the validity of some of the people voting on it, because there was a poll the other day on The Big Lebowski, and essentially it seems like an awful lot of people haven't seen The Big Lebowski, who are calling themselves film fans, and I don't quite understand what that is. I mean, the responses were basically, did you like it? Yes, no, haven't seen it, lol. And really, if you're calling yourself a film fan, you're not allowed to say, haven't seen it, lol. You have to go and watch it. This is what you do as a film fan.
I would like, can we drill down into the... I've used the term drill down 3 times tonight. What is going on? I've clearly latched onto that for some reason. Can we drill down into the demographic data there, Scott? I want to know where these people are coming from, who 53% of whom consider Red Dragon superior to Manhunter.
Yes, I do wonder if perhaps some people are voting who haven't actually seen Manhunter.
Yes,
that is really the only explanation that makes sense to me, but then maybe that's perhaps me not being suitably empathetic with other people, and that's why I'm not Will Graham.
How long may you continue not to be Will Graham, Scott? Lest of all you start to profile me. I think that probably wraps it up then. Was there any closing thought, Scott?
I think that's for a lot. I think we've said all we need to say about these films, so I guess at that point we'll just say that if you want to, of course, you can follow us on Twitter at Fuds on Film. You can email us at podcast@fudsonfilm. You can hit us up on Facebook. It's facebook.com/fudsonfilm, and we would love to hear from you in any way at all. Now, I did notice we've actually had another couple of iTunes reviews.
Wow.
I don't have the drill back on who they came from, so I will park that until our next podcast on the 20th to give you some proper shout-outs.
But if you're listening, a preemptive thank you, but we'll thank you properly by name once we have that data.
Yes, so we shall be with you on the 20th with another just a general catch-up of stuff what we have seen lately and that. But until then, I shall bid you adieu. I've been Scott Morris, and goodbye. And I'm sure my good friend Craig Eastman will also bid you goodbye.
Yes, I can't think of anything daft to say, so yes, goodbye.
You have disappointed me for the last time.
I was good. Well, Drew's finally back with us next episode, right?
Possibly.
So, possibly, we think so. So this will be my last opportunity for a while to say to you, Scott, it's just you and me now, sport. Aha! Oh, you'll see what I did there. Goodbye.